Hi! Round two. I'm so grateful that you're coming back. Tuesday night, there was just all kinds of complications, and the internet was going out, the sound was going in and out, and the recording was just way too difficult to try to sit through. So here we are again. The lighting's a little different because it's during the day, because I had to just get it in while I could so that I could get the information to you before this Tuesday. Because what we go over today builds on what we'll wrap up on Tuesday. Also, too, if you were with me on Tuesday night, you'll notice I was probably really low energy, and it was because I still felt really bad. But now I feel great. I still have kind of like this raspiness, but we're good to go. I think I'm excited to have a second chance, right? Because I think since I wasn't feeling well, I just was going slow. I wasn't able to get the information to you the way I really wanted to get it to you. So thank God that He is a God of second chances, and we get to do this over again. I think you'll be really pleased, or at least happier with this session, because it's gonna really break things down for you the way I intended to, but just ran out of time, didn't get to. So we're gonna improve this time. I'm learning through this process how to get better at giving you information. So let's jump right in, because I'm finding out that an hour is not long enough, because I am so talkative about things that really are not as important as I might think. So Tuesday night, I had started out by answering some questions, and I'll save those from now on just to answer on the side. The ones that I had answered, I thought were kind of nice questions, because one person had asked to go over the differences between the plain text Bibles and the study Bibles, and which ones I had, since I had mentioned I have several. And just real briefly, so that, because I do want to cover everything, just real briefly again, the differences you can tell if you just kind of read maybe like the first or second page usually of those study Bibles. If you go into Lifeway and you just browse that section, you can read those cover pages, and they give you the heart of that study Bible. So it tells you kind of what it's biased towards. And they're all different, so they're biased towards different things. So I have one that's and kind of like a cultural studies Bible is what it's called. It's an NIV, and I actually bought it for Matthew, my husband, but he's moved on to something different, and so now it's mine. But that one is, the heart of it is studying biblical archaeology and understanding the culture at the times, which is my heart. And this is how I'm going to present information to you, because, well, I like it. And I think it's really key in understanding, especially the Old Testament, and how that plays so beautifully in what Christ did for us. And then the Bible that I've showed you, well, I don't have it in front of me, which is hilarious, since this is a Bible study and I don't have my study Bible in front of me. But it's the one where I showed you that it's in pieces. That's the New Living Translation one that I have, and I've wore that thing out. There's just totally wore it out. That's a Life Application Study Bible. That's just in the notes at the bottom, the comment section. It kind of just tells you, or gives you a thought-provoking process of how can this apply in your life, or how can you apply this to just daily matters that you go through. And that's really it. There's more, and there's more to it, but that's me just kind of telling you. You can find out what the heart of it is if you just kind of read in the front of those Bibles. And then there was a question about, what did Christ study? And as I had told you about scrolls, he was a Jewish boy, so he would have studied what we're going to kind of talk about tonight. And that's, I'll let tonight kind of speak to that, and I'll circle back to it. Well, I say tonight, but it is clearly day. So jumping right into it. For some of you that had joined me Tuesday, stick with me, because this is going to be presented a little bit differently than I had presented it before, and I think you'll be more pleased with that. The PDF document that I'm going to drop in everyone's email this time, this will be the actual breakdown that I'm going to discuss right now. So don't stress if you can't write it all down and get it all in your notes. It's fine. I think you'll find that the real gold out of this whole process that we're going to go through is what I email you. Because like I said, I'm better at writing than I am speaking. So I think it makes more sense when it's in text and you can hold it in your hands. And so when you're studying your Bible, you'll have this really solid breakdown that you can recreate. You can change it up. You can do whatever you want. So it's a little abstract with the way I'm talking about it. But if you open up your emails after you see this video, or while you're watching this video, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. And I think you'll be so happy. So right into it. Today, we're talking about the Old Testament. And this is the part where I'm going to be a little bit detailed. And then we'll finish up Tuesday where I'm glazing over things. Because if you can get this, if you can understand what the story, how it sets up, everything, this is the meat potatoes, everything else will be gravy on top of it. And really it's all about setting you on your way so that when you study the Bible, you're not lost, you're completely on track. And if you get off track, you can refer back to the materials I'm giving you so that you have this kind of like you touch base. All right. So the Old Testament we've talked about is 3/4 of the Bible, and then the New Testament is about 1/4 of it. You can break down the Old Testament into 4 big sections. The first 5 books is typically known as the Pentateuch. I don't know why I was always terrified of that word. I have no clue, but I'm not anymore, and you shouldn't be either. It's just what it's referred to. First 5 books, and that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And I'm going to explain in short form how you can immediately recognize what's going on just by when you hear that name, the name of the books. And then the second part is going to be historical writings. The third would be the prophets. And then the fourth would be the poeticals. It doesn't necessarily have to be in that order, but I'll show you those sections by the end of Tuesday. You'll know those. Another name that the Bible is referred to, or it's really an acronym, and this is just a little bit of lagniappe, not something that you just absolutely have to remember, but it's neat to know. There's a Hebrew acronym called the Tanakh, and it corresponds with our Protestant Bible, but it's neat to know, and I'll explain it real quick. So the T in Tanakh stands for Torah, which translates into law. And as a lawyer, I love the law. But I especially like to kind of camp out on these first 5 books to kind of clear the air about the law. Because I think that's where people get really fuzzy and they get lost in the Old Testament. So we won't be after this session. And then the N stands for Nevi'im. And that's going to be all the prophetical books. And we will breeze through those, and I think you'll be really comfortable with how we do that. And then the K is the Ketuvim. The Ketuvim is going to be all the poetical type books, and it means writings. So these books are what you'll find are just, it's the product of some key players or key people that you are introduced to in the Torah and the Nevi'im. And we'll categorize those, and again, we'll breeze through them. So let's get into the composition of the Old Testament. So there's 39 books, and it's a collection. It was written over time. We can't say for sure when exactly it began being written, but if you recall back to the first night where we talked about it, the Israelites, because I'm going to go ahead and start referring to them as Israelites, because I explained in the first session, how they were the Hebrews. They were known as the Hebrews, and then they became known as the Israelites, and eventually called the Jews. You can go back to session 1 to see that, or I can explain it a little bit more if you want, and you can just email me. But last session we talked about how they were an oral society in the beginning, and then they shifted into writing. And so I talked about how Moses was a key player in bringing that technology to his people. And Moses lived around the 1400 BC. So we could kind of, since he's attributed to have written most of the books in the Pentateuch, you could reasonably assume that it was sometime around when he was alive. Let's see what else. Is there anything else I want to talk about on that? Nope. Let's go to Genesis. And I have to keep, I have to keep touching my computer because it goes blank on me for a minute. So if you see me looking down and doing that, that's what I'm doing. Okay, if you have that document that I've emailed to you while you're watching this, you can pull it up and it'd be super helpful. But don't worry about it. If you don't, just print it out later and just listen for now. But in each of these 5 books, I'm going to break them down into sections, and we're going to talk about them that way. And I think these chunks that we're breaking them down into will simplify it so that you can really understand exactly what's going on. And when we start Tuesday, no question about it, you know where we're at. So Genesis can be broken up into 2 large sections. We can go, first section is 1 through 11. So you can write that down or follow on the page. But anyway, first section is 1 through 11. And the second section is 12 through 50. So the first section, 1 through 11, we are all familiar with a lot of the stories that occur in these 11 chapters. So this is God establishing creation, establishing relationship with humanity. And then we start to see the very beginnings of really this cycle that in this relationship that we as humans continuously go through with God throughout the Old Testament and throughout the New Testament, and really we can even we can have that in our lives as well. But just real quick, 1 through 11, you see creation, you see Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and we witness the fall. And then we come to know about Adam and Eve having children. We get the first record of the first murder, Cain and Abel. And then we see how humanity goes terribly awry. And the key player here becomes Noah. And God floods the earth, and he then establishes the Noahic covenant, which is the first covenant that we see God go into with man outside of Adam and Eve. And even after this covenant, he tells Noah, go forth and be fruitful and multiply, the same way that he had done with Adam and Eve. And so this occurs, but then humanity, it goes awry again. And we see what happens in the Tower of Babel. And here's where the city of Babylon is established. Babylon plays a very key role later in some of the text that if you don't know or if you do know, we'll circle back to it. But Babylon eventually is where the Jews become exiled. And so that kind of sets up something for a little bit later. And that's 1 through 11. And so 12 through 50 opens up with God entering into a covenant with Abraham. And without going into terrible detail, the rest of 12 through 50 walks you through how this nation was birthed. So this nation was birthed through Abraham and Sarah. And then we know the story of Hagar, where she also had a son for Abraham. But the promise didn't pass through that son with Hagar. The promise passed through the son with Sarah. And that son's name was Isaac. And Isaac then had some children. And from those children came Jacob. And Jacob then was eventually renamed Israel. And he had 12 sons. Now that is a super oversimplified flow. But I can drop in some information to kind of like give you a family tree. But so you know, there are 3 key players there. So it's Abraham, who then the promise, the covenant, is then passed into his son Isaac, and Isaac then that's passed through to Jacob, and Jacob does this amazing thing where he has these 12 sons that then become kind of the center of everything else that occurs throughout the Old Testament. So it's just important to remember that 12 sons were born, and then they later become known, the 12 tribes of Israel. So while we're in Genesis 50, it kind of closes out with the story of the 11th son, which is Joseph. And Joseph is, he had been sold into slavery by his brothers. So he ends up in Egypt. And he finds favor in Pharaoh's court. And a great famine breaks out. And it's a beautiful story, but we can't go into detail so that we can get through all of this. But in that, like in his position, a big famine breaks out, and the brothers end up migrating, the entire family ends up migrating to Egypt, because at that time, since Joseph had favor with that Pharaoh actually welcomed them with open arms to come to Egypt, escape the famine, and survive. And that is Genesis. And like I said, it's in that PDF, so check that out. So then we move into Exodus. And Exodus, you can just, in your mind, just go ahead and know this is the same group of people 400 years later. So as we know, 400 years later, it's going to have expanded massively. So now it's this nation of Hebrews. And the difference is, now when it opens up 400 years later, there's a new Pharaoh, and he's oppressed these people, and they're in slavery. And this is not news to most of us, but just so that you can see the flow, 400 years later, we're in Exodus, and this is kind of sets it up. So Exodus can be broken up into 2 sections too. So 1 through 18, and then 19 through 40. So pretty easy, right? Just these 2 big chunks. And we're going to recognize these differences, and you'll see the shifts, and I'll let you know when they are. So 1 through 18 is going to be kind of telling you the story of how they ended up in this slavery. And like I've already kind of told you, the Pharaoh, he was threatened. They've grown. They're massive. And while they are oppressed, this doesn't appease him. So he calls for a mass genocide of the Hebrew baby boys. And from this story, we get the deliverer, which is Moses. And we've covered him a little bit last week. But through the life of Moses, or his being raised in Egyptian culture, he visits his people. There's some things that happen, but by the end of 1 through 18, Moses has risen as a deliverer. He approaches Pharaoh for his people's freedom. And then you see this is where the plagues occur, and this is where the Passover occurs. And these 2 big events lead to the Israelites being, they are the Israelites at this time, the Israelites being freed, and Moses leading them to Mount Sinai. So that's 1 through 18. Section 19 through 40, that's where they're at Mount Sinai. So 1 through 18 is all about how they escaped slavery and how Moses brought them to Mount Sinai. And then 19 through 40 is now we're at Mount Sinai. So what's important that occurs at Mount Sinai? Huge important things happen at Mount Sinai. This is where God offers the people to enter into a covenant, and he gives them the 10 commandments. And before we go much further into that, the commandments, the covenant, you can just jot it down. This is 19 through 24. So that's where all that law kind of occurs. And then there's the rest of the book. The rest of the book spends a lot of time on how to build this tabernacle that God, I don't know if he like really, if you could really say that he like demanded it be built, but he said, here, build this tabernacle, because what I'm going to do through this covenant, I'm going to come live in your presence, so that amongst you, so that I will be in your presence and I will be with you. Only thing you have to do is just keep my commands. So it was a conditional covenant, one where he held up his end of the bargain and they did not. So almost immediately after they entered the covenant, they built a golden calf and started worshiping idols. Ironically, I think that's the proper way to use that word. Ironically, the very first commandment was, you shall have no other gods before me. And then that's the first thing that they did. It's really important to put this into context. And you'll hear me harp context at all times. The Israelite people had just come from potentially all of 400 years of slavery. I'm sure it wasn't all 400 years, but they had just come out of slavery. They are an independent people without an independent laws and an independent way of governing themselves. So what they know is pagan Egyptian culture, where it's very polytheistic, where there are many gods that you can pray to for many things, and these gods are not personal gods. They're gods that are finicky, that really don't lay out what's the rules. They could sacrifice something to that god, and maybe that god would respond, and maybe you wouldn't. So in that context, you can see where this would be really hard for them. This is something totally foreign. There's this God that's telling them, if you obey my commands, I will bless you, and I will come and I will live amongst you, and all you got to do is just keep the commands, and I will bless you. Meaning he's going to love. This is a loving God, and this is a foreign concept at this time. So we know the concept of a loving God, but think back, all the way back then, the concept of a loving God, not necessarily something that they were accustomed to. And so that term, no other God before me, it didn't mean, well, you can still keep those other gods, just don't like them more than me. That's not what it meant at all. It meant I am the only one. So creating something to falsely worship, which is another one of the commandments, they were just breaking they were breaking the covenant, the agreement, immediately. So it shows at the end where, and also to the tabernacle, it gives the instructions on how to make the tabernacle. And, you can get into the details of how that tabernacle is built. The big idea is, when you're reading it, you'll see that it was meant to recreate the Garden of Eden. It was meant for these people to be able to be in the presence of their one true God and reestablish that personal relationship that had been broken in the Garden of Eden. So that wraps up Exodus. When we end up with Exodus, it's Moses, and he's getting ready to enter into this amazing tabernacle that's been built. But there's one really big problem, and it keeps him from entering. And that's what Leviticus is about. So Moses isn't able to enter into the tent because the people have broken the covenant, but God hasn't. So one of the key things is that they recognize God is holy, and they are not. So they've been given this law to follow, but they have no clue how to keep it. Leviticus is a how-to book, a how-to guide on how to be an ancient Israelite trying to be a holy people, and as an unholy people trying to be in the presence of a holy God. It's a how-to instructions. So keep in mind when you read it, you cannot read it the same way that you read Genesis in the same way that you read Exodus, because those are narratives. They're just telling the story, and it's real easy to read that way because there's really no challenges there. You're just understanding the progression of the story. Leviticus, read it differently. This is instruction manual, and it's broken down in the document so that you can take these in chunks, and it moves just like that. This thing right here. That's kind of what it does. So in Leviticus, it opens up. Man, stuff is way over there. Oh, there's a Bible over here somewhere. Here we go. I don't even know which one this is. I hope you don't care that I'm doing this. I'm sorry. So it's just fun to know this. Okay. So Leviticus 1 says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses from the tent." Key. And this is why I love words. And so from the tent, meaning Moses could not enter at the beginning of Leviticus. But when you break Leviticus down into its sections, you can see that by the end of it, he's able to. So let's see, where's my sections? So there's 3 big rotating sections in the book. One is rituals, laws on offerings, and laws on the festivals. And that section, those 2 different sections are 1 through 7, and then also 23 through 25. So 1 through 7 is going to be the offerings at the altar. And so they didn't burn everything for every reason. They did burn for burnt offerings, but then, oh, there's a fly. But then there's also different ones that served different purposes, and there were different ways that those needed to be executed properly, so that they could maybe do say thank you to God, which was grain offerings, or they could ask for forgiveness and or for covering, and those would be the burnt offerings or purification offerings. These were different, and Leviticus 1 through 7 does a really great job of just laying them out there. Now in my study Bible, it gives me kind of like a little, I guess almost like a title on one, and it'll say offerings for this, and chapter 2 offerings for this. So mine does that. I'm not sure if yours does, but now that you have something that recognizes that, you probably be able to see it as you're reading. And then 23 through 25 is ritual festivals. And the festivals were just a way to remind the people of all God has done for them. So say the Passover would be one of them, reminding the people of what occurred in Egypt and what allowed them to be free. So there's some rules on how you would do that. And then a second big section, or the other 2 big sections, would be about the priesthood. So 8 through 10 would tell you about how the priests were ordained. And so you'll see a lot of talk about the Aaronites and the Levites. So the Levites were put in charge of the tabernacle, and then the Aaronites were really kind of, the best way I know to describe it is they're kind of like a head pastor and associate pastor sort of relationship. They were serving the same purpose but in different capacities. Do you get that? So so you'll see that. So I'm only saying that so that you're not confused when you're reading in the details and you find, wait, I thought the Levites were the priests. Because you'll see in the Bible where it says, and then they tithe to the Levites, and then sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the Aaronites being the priests. So there's that first section regarding priesthood. So that's 8 through 10, and then 21 through 22 kind of just talks about the qualifications. None of these things are things that you really need to go into detail, and I'm about to tell you why. But the next big section, so we're going to be doing 3. So one is rituals, and then there's two little sections in the book that's going to cover that. And then the second big section is the priesthood, and then that's broken up too, and I've given you those references. And then the third big section is going to be the purification laws. that all have to deal with purity. And I think this is where people get really confused, where they say, does this still apply to me or does this not still apply to me? So first, let's just talk about those two sections you can find them in, and then we'll discuss that. Your purity laws in Leviticus are going to be 11 through 15. And these are just really, they're those really weird ones. That's like, if you touch blood, you got to do this, and then you got to stay away for however many days, and then you can approach God. Big picture of that is these are purity for cleanliness of the body. And the best way I know how to say that is, it's almost like your body is been exposed to something unhealthy that could potentially cause death, and it needs to be purified. And so you almost have this incubation period. So when you're reading in the text, you'll see it says there's something to do with, after childbirth, a woman's impure. She needs to stay kind of away from everybody for 7 days, and then there's some steps on how you could then get clean, and then you can approach God again. Those are temporary states that the body is in, and He's given some, here, this is how you would deal with this, and then you're fine, you can come on back. The next section is 18 through 20, and those are going to be your purity laws regarding moral purification. So this is kind of like the laws that help you refrain from moral impurity, and these are kind of more the deeper ones, like how this is where you can call this the how to be different than the surrounding pagan cultures how to section. One of the things that when you're reading this, you have to keep in mind that the surrounding cultures, especially the Canaanites, they are into child sacrifice, and they're into oppressive slavery, and there's some other stuff that they're into that's pretty scary. And so this is just kind of like how to be morally pure. Last section, but it's really kind of in the middle of Leviticus, is the atonement. And the atonement, without getting into detail again, is just where every year from here on out, the priest would take 2 goats. One would be a sacrifice on the altar as a purification, so to purify the people of Israel, or the Israelites, of their sin, and ask for forgiveness and a covering. And then the second one would be the scapegoat, where they would cast the sins into that goat, and then it'd go off. This is just a window into what Christ would have done for us on the cross. And we will go into atonement in a later week or whatever, but this is just so that you can understand the story. So the thing that I want you to keep in mind when you read Leviticus is that these are laws that are specifically geared towards this culture and this Israelite nation having, in the context of having left oppression and being ingrained with pagan culture, and not really having an identity, an independent identity. And this is God giving them a way to affect the laws that He gave them in Exodus. I hope that makes sense, because when I finally understood that, it made total sense to me, and I'm like, oh, I had kind of an epiphany moment. So so just after all that, just know that this is, put it in its context. Sometimes whenever you're approached by non-believers, they might quote things out of Leviticus and say, well, why don't you still do that? And now you have an answer. And you can confidently say, well, some of these, the one that you just quoted, it might be from, section 11 through 15. And now you can refer back to your notes, and you can say, well, that was a purification law that was specifically for at that time for those people. And this was just a way to kind of know how you could approach a God. In the polytheistic culture, they might not know. Would that have been enough? They have no clue. But what a loving God that says, here, I'm giving you the parameters. and I'm letting you know where you stand with me at all times. If you have touched blood and you're unclean, you know for certain you can't come into my presence, because he's a holy God. They understood that he was a holy God, and that made them impure at the time. There's we can get really deep into that. That might be for a later discussion, because it gets pretty intense on how to describe that and explain it, but not for tonight. And then finally, Leviticus closes out, and we move into Numbers. And the first line of Numbers is that God is speaking with Moses in the tabernacle, or the tent. So recognize that clearly they've been putting these practices into effect, and now Moses is able to enter the tent and enter into the presence of the Lord. I think that's neat. So Numbers, very simply, we are still at Mount Sinai. They've been there about a year, and so now they're just getting ready for hitting the road. They're going to go into the wilderness. And all Numbers is 3 big sections. And in these 3 big sections, you'll see they're not so massive, and there's a way to just kind of acknowledge it, and then we'll move on to Deuteronomy. So this first big section, my screen just keeps going dark on me. I don't know, like, I don't have like this amazing setup or anything like that. This is my first time to ever do it, so stick with me. So 3 big sections, and then there's these 2 little tiny sections. The best way that I know how to describe it is, let's just say let's call Mount Sinai, Louisiana, and the promised land is Wyoming or something. I don't know, New York, pick a place. And we know that this is going to be a long trip, and we're going to stop in 2 places and then our destination. And so these 3 big sections will be kind of like our hotel stays. And then these 2 little sections, this is where the kids keep going, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And you ready to smack them the whole time? At least I am. Okay, so anyway, 1 through 10, they are out Mount Sinai. And what Moses does here is he just kind of, it's basically like he's laying down the rules. Okay, so guys, we're about to go on this long trip. I don't think he ever anticipated 40 years. In fact, I know he didn't. But guys, we're going on this long trip. Let's review, kids, the covenant and the commandments. And we need to do that because we're going to come into contact with other things. We're going to endure some stuff. And I want you to be spiritually fit to do this. And so then they hit the road, and then this other little section, this tiny little section, they've been on the road for 3 days, and already, are we there yet? So you'll see this continuously go through Numbers, through Numbers, where they start complaining, and you see God issue some partial justice, where for those kind of rebels, they're handled, but then he continues to be gracious. They're complaining about manna and all those things throughout the book, and he continues to provide. And if you're really looking at it through a parent perspective, and that's kind of why I set it up to say you're moving, and the kids are in the back seat, and they're constantly complaining, and you're just trying to get them where you need to go, because you know that once you get to that new place that you're going to be living, it's for their benefit, but they're being brats. So that's the best way I know how to give you a visual, so that whenever you're reading it, if you do decide to study Numbers, that this is what's going on. So moving, complaining, and he's providing. So then the next big section, so we're stopped and we're going to camp out here, the wilderness of Paran, which for some reason in my mind, before I knew what the wilderness of Paran actually was, I always kind of thought that it was like, I don't know, trees and stuff every once in a while, but it's not. It's a desert. It's desolate, and it's close enough to the promised land that Moses sends in spies, He sends in 12, which is representative of the 12 tribes of Israel. And a lanyard, I just want you to just tuck it in the back of your mind. Just only because I saw it, I see it, and I want you to see it and recognize it and go, oh, wow, that's so cool. So when those spies come back, 2 of those tribes are faithful and they're hopeful, and they understand that God's going to go before them, or before all of the Israelites, and he'll make a way. The other 10 are faithless, and with their faithlessness, it rallies up everybody. And big picture here, what happens is the people begin to shift and put their faith in these 10 spies, instead of putting their faith in the Lord, that the Lord has brought them, is going to take them to the promised land and then deliver them to it. They put their faith in man and start complaining, and they say, well, you might as well just let us die out here in the wilderness. And because God is a gentleman, he allows you to make your choices. And then he allows you to endure whatever the consequences are of that choice. And that's what happened. Because he said, fine, that's what you'll do. You all will die in the wilderness. But I am faithful to my promises. And I am faithful to my end of the bargain. And so your children will be able to enter the promised land. But I'm going to honor what you want, because all you've done is complain. And that's what you're going to get. But I'll continue to hold up my end. I said that I would deliver Abraham's people into the promised land, and that's what I'm going to do. But it's going to be your children instead. So the people try to enter anyway, and then the Canaanites run back. I forget how far back they did, but then this sets them into the next 40 years of being in the wilderness. All right, so then 20 through 22. The little tiny piece, this is them traveling through the lands, and then you'll see a bunch of cycles going on of complain. God punishes the ones that, the instigators, perpetrators, whatever, and then you'll see him gracefully bring them back in the last big section, 22 through 36. You'll see him bring them back, and they are now the newer generation approaching the promised land, and they're going to succeed this time. So that is all of Numbers. If you get anything from Numbers, it's that they set out from Mount Sinai, they approached the promised land. Moses sent in spies. They approached the promised land, and because of what these spies had to say, they lost their faith in God. They then put their faith in these spies' opinion about whether or not that they were going to be able to go into the promised land or not. And this prompted God to say, fine, you can go back you'll go into the wilderness, and that's where you'll stay, but you're only your children, and you'll only be able to come back until your children are able to enter in. And so now he's been faithful. They are back. They are about to enter into the promised land, and Moses will now be the most prominent figure of the last book in the Torah, which is Deuteronomy. So hopefully this is fleshing it out a little bit better. For those of you that watched Tuesday night, hopefully this fleshes it out better. Let me know. I hope so. And then also for you that are just now getting to watch the recording for now, hopefully you're getting this too. So Deuteronomy, we'll hem that up too. 3 big sections for Deuteronomy. This is just Moses. This is Coach Moses. And I think I even said this on the PDF. This is Moses. Just look at him as a coach. It is this massive big game, and everyone's in a huddle, and he's going to give you this pep talk. The first section, 1 through 11, that's him reviewing. Computer screen's black again. That's him giving the kiddos a history lesson. These are the second generation, right? Or, second generation. I don't want to dive too deep into that. But they probably weren't a part of the group that experienced the Exodus. They've heard the stories firsthand. But what they need is to be reminded of what God has done for them. Reminded of, how far and how far they've come and how faithful God has been, even not because of who they are, but kind of despite what occurred the first time around. And then it's here where you see the Shema, which is a very famous part where Moses says, love the Lord with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. I mean, I'm paraphrasing that, but one of the key things I need you to remember is the Shema is talking about listening. And I hope that when I illustrate this, you totally get what I'm saying. In the Hebrew text, this particular word that's used, the listen is not just, hey, listen, I want to say something. It's not like that. Where listen, turn your ears on so that you can hear the syllables coming out of my mouth. It's a listen to understand and obey. So children, and this is the best way I know how to do it because I'm a mother. Whenever I say, listen to me, and I want you to understand what I'm saying. Okay, that's the context of what this is. So, and I think we all know whenever you drop down to that Batman voice to your kids and you're going, listen, they know, they better tune in and understand what you're saying. I don't know how to articulate this in a beautiful way. If I could just type it to you, I'd nail it. But I can't with my words. But this listen and obey is to equate, if you listened and you obeyed, you were essentially loving. To love is to obey. And this is something that is key in understanding the law that Christ left with us. And this is why I'm emphasizing the law part of the Old Testament. But let me just finish up with Deuteronomy. So 12 through 26, this is Moses reviewing the covenant and the law and then giving laws that are more relevant to the new generation. So the laws, while they were part of the covenant, they're not necessarily stagnant, kind of like our laws, right? So we have state and national laws that the details of them tweak because our communities are changing, we as a people change, but the principles of them don't change, right? So murder is murder, but who's to say the elements of murder might not change? We might heighten the threshold of what a particular element, and I might lose you, I'm so sorry, but this is just kind of my legal mind. We might heighten the threshold for what might constitute a murder or not even murder. Let's go into maybe there's something to do with a home invasion. There's certain elements. Let's just say there's 5 particular elements that it's broken down into, and maybe on that 5th element, in order to meet the threshold that would then be able to convict someone of a home invasion, maybe we elevate the threshold, and it has to be something even more or even less than that would be able to convict someone of that. Don't pay too much attention to that, except for I'm just trying to illustrate that the laws can change in detail, but the principles still be the same, so it can accomplish the same end result. And then 27 through 34, this is kind of like the sad but beautiful part, is Moses gives them a warning and a choice, and you will see this theme kind of keep going through the rest of the Old Testament. The prophets are going to give warning and choice. And Moses says, choose to listen and obey and love. And if you, in doing so, you'll keep the commands and you'll be able to choose life. So choose God's way. Or if you disobey, if you don't listen, you're choosing to perish. And then he tells them, you know what? I know you're not. Anyway, I've been with you as long as I've been with you, and I know the character of you as a people, and you're not going to succeed at this. But I'm hopeful that you will, and there is a hope in a future for Israel, and this is where he then blesses Joshua. And Joshua is going to be a leader that parallels Moses. But in a more, he'll parallel Moses, but then the people and their future is a little bit more successful. But this is where Moses passes away. And there's some semantics about the language, but it says God buried him. And so Moses doesn't enter the promised land. And for the longest, I used to think, God, he was so faithful to God, even if he did kind of get out of line at least one part in the story or a couple times. But I used to think, wow, why wasn't he able to go into the promised land? And then I realized he got something so much better. He entered into the presence of the Lord. So, and there's something in the New Testament that echoes back to that, but I did want to just point that out. We could probably just quickly and briefly hop into Joshua, and it's not a part of the first 5 in the Torah, but Joshua then, just like Moses, he rallies up the troops. I say troops, they're not troops, but he rallies the people up. They enter into Canaan, and they do, after a bunch of battles, they do take possession. And they do come to live in the promised land. So they are delivered into the promised land as promised, despite all of the complaining and the lack of faith and the worshiping of the idols and the breaking the covenant. God is a faithful Lord, and he kept his promises to Abraham, and he kept his promise about the first generation dying in the wilderness, and that the children would inherit the land. Joshua can be broken into 4 main parts, and really, really quickly, I'll just say 1 through 5 is him leading them into the promised land. What else? There's a bunch of battle. Probably 6 through 12 is going to be battling. I don't know if you're interested in the battles. I don't necessarily care for them, but that's just it. 13 through 22 is going to be him dividing up the land amongst the 12. And so this is key. You don't necessarily need to know where the lands were and all that, but just know that when they conquered the land, he then divided it up between the 12 nations. And then 23 through 24 as him just giving a final speech, just the way Moses did. And then next Tuesday, coming up Tuesday, we'll leap into covering the final parts of the Old Testament. I'll tell you why that final part is important. The reason why I wanted you to really get a really solid, firm grasp on the Torah is because the Torah is the law. And ultimately, after you get through those first 5 books, you'll see that there's one more giant progression. We'll cover that very fast Tuesday so that you can kind of, and I'll give you material that will help you completely compute that. But you will get to see that after this one final development, the prophets in the books refer to these final developments in this law, and that they fit in here in some places, and that which would be the Nevi'im, and then the Ketuvim part, the propheticals, the people that are going to be introduced on Tuesday. These books tie into those people, so we don't have to spend near as much time understanding the law of the Torah, and understanding that how all the things that came about, how God delivered the people, and then he went into the covenant with them and told them, here's your law, here's your covenant, and then Leviticus explaining how that's supposed to be kept, and then Numbers and Deuteronomy showing how time and time again they failed to keep the law. It points forward to what Christ has done. And so that we will understand by the end of this why it said that Christ came and he fulfilled the law. I hope that you enjoyed this. I certainly enjoy giving information this way. I fully intended to do that on Tuesday, but, you know, I'm just glad that I was able to redo it. Maybe it happened exactly the way it was supposed to, because I feel like this was a much better way of giving you the information. I love you. I love you. I love you. I hope I see you Tuesday on the live feed. I'll let you know somehow on how to do the chat. I have so many messages that say I'm watching, but I don't know how to do the chat. So I'll post that on the Facebook. Love you. Thanks.